Hi there, I'm Chris Murray. I'm a Senior Associate here at Bird & Bird and I specialise in public procurement law.
And I'm Claire Gamage, also a Senior Associate here at Bird & Bird, specialising in public procurement and state aid law.
And this is the latest in our series of short Brexit-related videos, and we are going to concentrate on the implications of Brexit on the public procurement regime.
So, Chris, you're going to explain to everyone out there today exactly why we've chosen to focus on public procurement.
Yeah, so I think there's two reasons. The first being one of timing. We are leaving the European Union on the 31st of January. And I think the second relates to the fact that until quite recently, the discussion on what's likely to happen to the public procurement rules post-Brexit has been somewhat muted, because I think there's been an expectation that there would be a fair amount of alignment between the EU and the UK. But there's been indications from government, from quite senior individuals within government over the past couple of weeks, which suggest that that may not be the case.
What we are clear on is that under Boris Johnson's withdrawal agreement, we will continue to follow the EU public procurement regime that we're all familiar with until at least the 31st of December 2020. During this time, the UK will be trying to negotiate some sort of trade deal with the EU. Now, of course, if we do get to a position where either the transition period isn't extended or we can't reach a trade deal with the EU, we of course leave on a no-deal basis. And that of course leaves open quite a lot of options in terms of what our public procurement regime may look like. It's probably also worth noting that under the withdrawal agreement, of course, there is this provision where if you have initiated a procurement process during the transition period, the old or current procurement regime that we're familiar with at the moment will continue to apply. Therefore, for example, if you have started a procurement process in June, however, you're not envisaging awarding that contract until the following June 2021, the current public procurement regime would apply to that contract. I think the other thing to think about as well is the issues of extending contracts. Existing arrangements are likely to be more prevalent. So until at least there's a clearer picture of what will happen after the end of December.
So at the top of the video, we mentioned that until quite recently, I think there was an expectation that the system that would be in place post-Brexit would be very similar to the system that we have just now, because there was an expectation that there would be a fair amount of political alignment between the two. And I think there was also cause to think that that would have been the case under Boris Johnson's premiership, particularly because the political declaration, which is the non-binding and very outline framework of a future trading relationship between the UK and the EU, has expressed a willingness to go beyond the fallback position or the baseline position on public procurement. And that baseline position is the WTO's Government Procurement Agreement, which we'll come to in a bit more detail later. And what the political declaration said was that, as I say, we would go beyond the terms of the GPA, which suggests a relationship which is pretty comprehensive, I think, and well aligned with Europe. But as I say, more recently, there's been noises from government, particularly loud noises from the likes of Dominic Cummings, who is the Prime Minister's chief special advisor, who, in fairness, has never been much of a fan of public procurement rules. But what he said is that the current rules are complex, slow and wasteful, and that they favour large organisations. And he wants to see a refresh of those rules.
So do you have any thoughts, Chris, in terms of where that will get us?
Well, I think it probably gets us back to the GPA that I mentioned earlier on, and so it's probably worth just having a quick look at that. So currently the UK is a member of the WTO's GPA, but it's only a member by virtue of its membership of the European Union. And the government has, for some time now, committed to becoming a member of the GPA in its own right. So I think it's fair to say that we know that in the event of a no-deal Brexit after the transition period, our system will at least comply with the requirements under the GPA.
What are the key differences then if we're operating under a GPA-only regime?
Well, I mean, I think it's certainly the case that the GPA rules are much less prescriptive than the current EU-led rules that we have. But having said that, they're not markedly different. They are still relatively stringent. They certainly don't cover sectors like defence. They don't cover private utilities. They arguably don't cover concession contracts, framework agreements. But they do set out a set of principles and a set of procedures that have to be followed when procuring contracts.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say, Chris, as well, that there is a reason why the UK would want to continue to be a member of the GPA, and the primary reason being that's access to a 1.3 trillion per annum international procurement market. So there are some key advantages in being in that group.
Without doubt, and with that access obviously comes the price of having to follow those rules. But we're certainly used to following procurement rules here in the UK in any event.
So I think another point as well is that I guess the UK could diverge on a number of areas if we did operate under a GPA regime. One being, of course, do we really need so many different sets of regulations? I mean, we have one for public contracts, utilities, concessions. Can you see sort of any more divergence?
Well, I mean, I think I would definitely agree with that. In fact, leading academic in this area, Professor Sue Arrowsmith, has just released a paper, and one of the key recommendations that she sets out is simplification of the rules, to have a single set of rules that apply across the public sector and the utility sector, the defence sector, for example.
I think another area where we might see some divergence also is the inclusion of social, economic and environmental criteria within procurement processes. Although we do see some of this at the moment, it can actually be quite difficult to use that kind of criteria. And I think, therefore, if we don't have that sort of layer of regulation of the procurement rules, we'll start to see more of that type of criteria creep in.
I think the final area as well where we may see some changes is around enforcement. So right now we have a standstill period at the end of a procurement process. We have the automatic suspension of contracts if a challenge is brought within the relevant period. We have things like the remedy of ineffectiveness, where contracts can potentially be voided going forward if there's been some breach of the procurement rules. And none of those aspects are required under the GPA rules. And so there's definitely scope for there to be a new enforcement mechanism. And with that, I think it also gives us an opportunity to consider who's best at enforcing compliance with the procurement rules. Right now, enforcement can only be done through the court. So in England and Wales, it's in the High Court. That enforcement process is costly, and it's lengthy, and it puts people off. And I think going forward, if there is to be a new enforcement regime, there's certainly the chance for us to discuss again the possibility of perhaps having a public procurement tribunal, complaints tribunal, to decide these sorts of matters.
So in terms of the things that you might want to think about at the moment, we are aware that a lot of central government and local authority organisations are writing to public sector suppliers to ask them if they're willing to remain committed to the pricing they have proposed in a pre-Brexit scenario. So you may wish to check your existing contracts, what they say about force majeure and where price variations are permitted. That will be quite a key factor if we do end up in that no-deal scenario.
Another thing that I think is worth keeping an eye on is how public contracting opportunities are advertised. Right now, everyone is used to searching the OJEU, the official journal of the European Union, to find opportunities. But in the event of Brexit, in the event of a no-deal Brexit, the UK government has said that it's setting up a new system, a UK-specific system called Find a Tender. I think finally as well, what I would say is that keep an eye on how the negotiations are going, and if it looks likely that we will end up in a no-deal Brexit situation at the end of the transition period, and you are a UK-based company with no overseas subsidiaries, you may find it more difficult to win business in the EU. You may therefore want to think about perhaps setting up a subsidiary company in an EU member state.
Thank you for listening to us today. We hope the video has been helpful and has answered some of the questions you may have about what will happen with public procurement post-Brexit. And of course, if you do have any further questions, we are happy to answer those, so do please get in contact.